Morning, everybody. Glad to see you here again on Daniel Davis's Deep Dive, where we take a look at issues on a much deeper level that you need to know, things that you're not usually told by the major media, things that are important for you to understand the situations and the events that are happening around you. Today is another one of those where we have something that's going to be giving you information that you probably don't know and things that you may not have even seen on some of the major news media. And those places that did cover it didn't go into the depth necessary to give you the real so what and why it's important for you to know. There was a press conference given earlier this month by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg discussing the entrance into the NATO of Sweden and some of the other people who want to come in there, and talking about how we've expanded it. And in the middle of that press conference, he's going to give what he's basically characterizing as a explanation of why Putin was wrong and to start this war. What he's not going to realize, or it doesn't appear that he does, is that he inadvertently undercuts all of the claims that the West and NATO has made from the outset about the reasons and the justification for the war. Now, most people take as just an understanding that because this has been repeated ad nauseum throughout the Western media throughout all 18 months of this war, is that this was a naked aggression by Russia, that it was just a land grab, that Putin wants to recreate the Soviet Union. I've lost count of the times I've heard that, but there's always some version of those. And of course, the reason we do this is because Americans in particular, but most people seem to like things nice and clean. We want a good guy and we want a bad guy. We like evil, or we like to know where evil is, and we like to know where the good guys are. And of course, the bad guys are all evil and the good guys are all good. So that makes it nice and clean and easy to just say, yep, Russia's the bad guy and Ukraine's the good guy. So we're going to get behind the good guy and we're going to work against the bad guy, because that makes it easy. When you get into reality, though, and you see that things are a lot more messy in real life, that there are no clear-cut lines. Let me just make sure everybody's point blank very clear on this point. There are no clean-cut good guys and bad guys. You have guys with one perspective, you have another side with another perspective. You can find all kinds of things that are bad and villainous about Russia. There is no doubt about it. This is, make sure everybody's also clear, this is no defense of Russia. This is no defense of Putin at all. This is an honest evaluation of what actually is going on the ground, because you can also find things that are bad about the Ukraine side, about some of the things that they have done in combat, about some of the decisions their leaders have made, and the impact and consequence it has for us. And this is also not to demonize Zelensky. As I've said many times on this show, there's many things about him which I admire greatly, and I have a great empathy for the extraordinary amount of pressure and stress that's on him on an hourly basis, because he's got the lives of millions of his countrymen that live and die based on his words. And that's got to be pressure that's really hard to fathom for us. But what the most important thing that we want to get here is that from the American perspective, and from our decisions about whether we want to continue to support war or whether different policies might be necessary, in order to come to that conclusion and to answer that question accurately for ourselves, we have to know what's really going on. And how this war started is very, very illustrative of the, I'm not sure I'll call it outright deception, but certainly the disinformation that's putting out by some of us on the Western side to justify what we're doing that is not entirely accurate. Now, this war did not start the way that that we have been led to believe it did. And before I tell you what really happened, first let's see what Jens Stoltenberg actually did say.
So first of all, it is historic that now Finland is a member of the alliance. And we have to remember the background. The background was that President Putin declared in the autumn of 2021, and he actually sent a draft treaty that he wanted NATO to sign, to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was what he sent us. And that was a precondition for not invade Ukraine. Of course, he wanted us to sign a promise never to enlarge NATO. He wanted us to remove our military infrastructure in all allies that have joined NATO since 1997, meaning half of NATO, all the Central and Eastern Europe. We should remove NATO from that part of our alliance. introducing some kind of E and B or second-class membership. We rejected that. So he went to war to prevent NATO, more NATO close to his borders. He has got the exact opposite.
Okay, several things there. We'll start with the last thing he said there at first. He straight out said Russia went to war to avoid NATO on his borders. So this can't have surprised anyone in NATO that they're risking war to be able to say we're going to continue to expand NATO. Now, this whole thing actually goes all the way back to 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, where NATO for the first time declared that they would allow Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. They didn't put a date on it at that time, but they declared it was going to happen. So the clock started ticking. And in immediate reaction to that, Putin went to the Munich Security Conference that was later that same year and declared, look, this is not going to work out for us. There's no way we're going to allow NATO military alliance to advance all the way up to our borders in the most important parts of our country. And it's just not going to happen. And he tried to use lots of diplomatic language saying like, you know, you guys would never allow this and we're not going to either. And just putting down a pretty solid marker. So we've known from the outset that to go there is going to be a real problem for Russia. And they have been able to, or they have continued to say that over the years since then. They showed also in 2008 how deadly serious they were, that they used limited force against Georgia to prevent NATO from coming into their country. And they also showed very clearly that it's their desire is not to conquer territory. Their desire is to keep their territory safe, because they don't want a nuclear superpower and then I think it was 29 member alliance off of their direct borders on the land that would lead straight into Moscow, if that's the way the West ever chose to. And of course, we say constantly, hey, this is a defensive alliance. We don't have any offensive capacity towards anyone. And of course, most in the West will say, yeah, it's a defensive alliance. It's always been a defensive alliance. But you have to look at this from the perspective of the other side. When you're talking about, do we go to war? Are we going to get into a situation where there could be war? There better be a damn well good reason. And that means that you should never use the instrument of war unless your physical life or livelihood is being directly threatened. And if you don't take action, your people are going to be attacked. That should be the only time you use war. Anything else is going to be messy diplomacy, messy negotiations, not war. You can't, you shouldn't use war just to get your way. And so Russia has been saying from the outset that if you continue to advance your military alliance, your so-called, from their perspective, you say, the West, that this is a defensive alliance, and yet you keep advancing closer and closer to our borders. So from the Russian perspective, it's not a defensive alliance, and it puts their nation at great risk if there's literally no room, any kind of a buffer zone from potential adversary military forces that could come right up to their border. Let me just tell you flat out, if this were reversed, the United States would never tolerate this on the other side. If China wanted to make any kind of a military pact with Canada or with Mexico, we would not be fine with it. If China came and said, hey, this is just a defensive alliance, this is just us bilateral working with, our partners here, we'd never tolerate it. We would never tolerate it, and we would never allow it. I dare say we would be willing to go to war to prevent that outcome because of the very real threat that it would pose to us. So the question has to be the honest question that we've got to answer. Why would we expect Russia to react differently than we would under the exact same circumstances? And yet that's what we have here. Now, in case anybody's thinking that this is just revisionist history, at the time that Stoltenberg was talking about the things that happened prior, especially in the lead up to this war, I went on several news shows and I tried to emphatically say, look, we're heading to war. And if we don't make some changes, there's war is going to come. The first of which was that we're going to talk about today anyway, was in November. I believe it was on Fox News when the Russian buildup had started, and there was lots of troops. I think at the time there was 100,000 that were around the border with Ukraine. And so people were starting to say, hey, is this just posturing or is there a possibility for war? So I went on Fox and I said this.
the Russians will make decisions that we don't think are rational, but are rational to them, and that they may risk potential near-term problems with the U.S. and NATO to secure their national interests on their borders. And Putin has been very clear he feels that way.
Now, there's something that's real important to say, also to point out here, right at this point, that the desire to advance NATO, to expand NATO, you should not even have a military alliance unless there is some kind of need for collective security, that your security is at risk and imperiled if you're by yourself. And so we're looking at this from the American perspective, not from any other member of NATO or Europe, but just from our perspective. So we should not expand NATO, and we should not incur additional Article 5 guarantees that we may have to go to war on behalf of another country unless our security is going to be improved. By any stretch, by any definition of military necessity, by looking at the national security case, there is no chance that we could ever have claimed that adding Ukraine, which had a really tense relationship with Russia, was going to somehow make our security better. And I pointed this out also prior to the war. This is what I had to say also to Fox News.
There's a couple of hard truths that have to be accepted here by President Biden and really everybody in the West. And that is, number one, we just got to acknowledge Ukraine is never going to come into NATO. We don't want them into NATO. It would be bad for the alliance. And all it would do is raise the prospect for war for all of us on a perpetual basis. That is the worst thing we want. Concurrently, Putin has shown since 2008 he is willing to use limited military force to prevent his border from being hosting a NATO country. And he has now shown very graphically he's willing to do the same thing here in 2022. So what that should tell President Biden is, look, just acknowledge reality. Ukraine's not coming in, so let's don't hold a staunch position that the door will remain open when we know that that's likely to be Putin's last chance to go ahead and invade.
That's one of the things, that door open. That was a phrase that Stoltenberg himself used in the run-up when Putin was very publicly saying, which Stoltenberg mentioned in that clip I showed you a minute ago. Putin had said, basically, here's how we can avoid war. If you'll declare neutrality and that Ukraine won't come into NATO, then there won't be war. He added some other conditions that we would not accept. Putin said, hey, you also have to roll back all the NATO members that had joined since 1997, all their military, and we would never do that. But the point being that it's the neutrality, it's the NATO on his border that was the real issue. Everything else can be negotiated, which was my point a while ago. Lots of things can be ugly negotiations and difficult and time-consuming as long as our security is not threatened because someone attacks us. That's the whole point. And that's what wasn't even on the table. Russia didn't have the military capacity to attack NATO. You would have to understand that. Now, it's even stronger now, but even at the time, Russia didn't have the manpower. They didn't have the force structure. They didn't have the number of tanks. The logistics system was the biggest Achilles heel. They didn't even have the capacity, the possibility to roll into a NATO country and like roll into West as though Germany once rolled across Europe. Germany in the World War II had the military capacity. They had the logistics. They had the aircraft. They had the Navy. They had everything they needed. So that was a very real threat, and that Hitler had declared that he had, these aspirations in Mein Kampf and several other means. Putin doesn't have that. Whether he desires to go back in time and recreate the USSR or wants to see himself as in a modern day Peter the Great is irrelevant. The only thing that is very relevant is, can he do it? Did he have the capacity to do it that necessitated the expansion of NATO up to his border? The answer is unequivocally no. Now, let's get into the consequences of this now. Now, there's one other piece I had that was just on the eve of war. Right before this happened, I went on to CNN and was asked about the even growing twist. I think at that time, the number of Russian troops had expanded up to near 150 or 180,000, something. It was much larger than, and it was very clear that we were in the last days prior to war. And this is what I had to say.
Ukraine on their own cannot defend against the armada that's amassed against them. So that's why it is so important that right now that we need to really just look at things on a cold reality base and acknowledge that we can't stay with the status quo and keep Ukraine from being invaded. We can't go with these deterrence things that we want, like with sanctions or whatever, thinking that's going to stop Putin, because it's almost certainly will not. We got to do something different if we want to avoid that outcome.
And we didn't. We did not avoid that outcome. We didn't do anything to change the outcome. Even though any rational explanation, assessment, which I made at the time and have made every month since, Ukraine does not have the military capacity to win a war against Russia. Russia went in there with a terrible decision. Russia went in there with an awful strategy. Their operations were bad. Their tactics were bad. We didn't realize just how bad their military was at that time. We thought it was much better. It looked better on paper. Yet still, they ended up taking like 25% of the country right away. And then once Ukraine did its, it showed its bravery and its tenacity, and they stormed back and exposed a lot of the Russian failures, and they took back about half of what they initially lost, and now it's about 17%, which it stayed. But you see, though, that in those 17 months, they have now lost hundreds of thousands of troops. They don't have the capacity to push Russia out, which we now have conclusive proof of, that after a half a year of preparations and now almost 4 months of execution, Ukraine cannot push further. They cannot get any more Russians out of there. It's just minuscule little dots on the map here, which Russia may be at risk of recapturing later this year when they conduct their expected counteroffensive to that. And you cannot replace the losses that Ukraine has had. And that's what's so important to understand. Ukraine never had the capacity to win a war against Russia. We knew that. If we had the slightest ability to be able to make accurate assessments on military capacity, we knew that Ukraine could not win a war against Russia. Then one has to ask, when it was very clear, and Stoltenberg has now admitted and made very clear that he knew that Putin was ready to go to war if NATO advanced up to his border. And he said, all you got to do is sign neutrality and a couple of other things, but basically no NATO on his border. That's been the one non-negotiable for Putin from the beginning. We knew that. Stoltenberg knew it. He knew that we could have avoided that outcome. But instead, we staunchly said, no, the door is going to remain open. Nobody's going to tell us who can come in and who can't. No external power, because we got our pride in the way. And now what have we gained for our pride? What have we gained for the people of Ukraine? What have we gained for NATO? What have we gained for America? Is America's security now better today because we staunchly refuse to take, a little bit of humility and avoid a war that we didn't need to fight back then? Have we gained anything? The answer is no. Clearly, we're in much worse case now. How many of our combat vehicles are gone now than were here before? Abrams tanks are now gone. Patriot air defense systems, Paladin self-propelled artillery, 155 millimeter towed howitzers, millions of rounds that were once in our own inventories for potential use if we ever needed to go to war, all gone. $113 billion gone. And that's just for us in money and in material. Now let's look at our so-called friend that we say is our friend in Ukraine. What's it cost them? Thousands of vehicles of all the different kinds. Their military has just been gashed. 200,000 at the bare minimum. And I firmly believe the number is much higher than that of men killed and wounded. And there's no more prospect today for them to regain what they had. And there's a higher probability that they'll lose more territory through the rest of this war than that they'll ever recover what they had here. Because, as again, I point out, after an abysmal beginning for Russia, they have now learned many lessons. They're improving a lot, and they're growing their military even larger. It today may be larger than on the day they invaded, and there's probably more Russians in Ukraine today than there was at the outset of that war. Let that sink in for a second. All the things that we have done for this war have cost our so-called friend egregious. I mean, it's almost wiped out a generation of their future. It's gone. Almost 20% of their country is gone. It's probably never coming back. They could still lose more. Our own military capacity is now weakened from what it was. We're deeper in debt because we didn't have $100 billion just extra hanging around. And if we do, as the administration is claiming, then this coming year, give them an additional $100 billion of our money, throwing us deeper into debt. All of this does is weaken us. The economy. I could do a whole one of these deep dives on the economy. All these sanctions we put on Russia, all of this stuff has rebound effects that we're paying for, that our allies, our actual allies in Europe are paying for. All of these are consequences of this war that should never have been fought. Now, in time, we can recover. We can rebuild our tanks and our artillery pieces and rebuild our shell inventories. With enough time, our economy can bounce back and we can recover from those losses. Ukraine can't. Ukraine cannot just rebound back this. Their losses are permanent. I'm telling you, the heart of a whole generation of men is already gone. So what kind of future are they going to have? How are they going to rebuild, even if we give them additional hundreds of billions, which is going to require for them to recover once the war does finally end? Where's that money coming from? And the longer we allow this war to continue on, the greater the cost to Ukraine and the worse our own national security. And of course, the longer this thing goes, it keeps alive the possibility that it could expand beyond the borders of Ukraine, that some accident, some miscalculation, some just bad decision by somebody somewhere, an errant missile hits the wrong target across a border, and suddenly we could find ourselves in a war that, for God's sake, should never have been fought and should never be fought. And if it escalates into nuclear escalation, then all bets are off, and who even knows how bad it could get then. I dare not even think of it. But we dare not even go there. We need to now sober up and do what many of us suggested prior to this war, that we'd not fight the war. Okay, that advice was ignored, and now we're all paying the price for that. Now it's time to say, we got to sober up right now and do the right thing for our country, for our friend Ukraine, and for the people in Ukraine who are not dead yet, who, as I make this video, are still alive. Let's don't keep the war for arrogant and presumptuous sake and say, no, we're not going to let Putin have any kind of success at all. And it's going to come at the cost of thousands more Ukrainians to pay for our arrogance and our presumptuousness. Arrogance that's not valid, by the way. It's not based on any actual strength, because we see our strength is dissipating. This is costing us. Make sure you understand that. This is costing us to continue on this path. It is time for us to reevaluate, take a deep breath, and say, all right, we need to change this here. We need to start putting more emphasis on diplomacy and find a negotiated settlement to this, instead of just reflexively throwing more ammunition at Ukraine and saying for as long as it takes. That's not a strategy. It doesn't even have a capacity to go anywhere. It doesn't have a plan. You don't even know what you want to accomplish by saying as long as it takes and throwing more ammunition out there. You just kind of hope that it works out good, but there's no actual plan. And all that's going to do is get more Ukrainian people killed, and it's going to continue to weaken our own country. Isn't that enough to finally say, enough is enough? There's not going to be a good outcome of this, but we can keep it from becoming a catastrophic and a terrible one. It's time to change what we're doing. And you need to understand that what you're being told is not accurate, and we are not moving in the right direction. And that's your deep dive for this Saturday. Thank you.